So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us in this panel on human capital. My name is Gonzalo Schwarz. I'm the founder and CEO of the Archbridge Institute, a think tank in Washington focused on lifting barriers to social mobility and human flourishing. And as a short story, yesterday Jim, Carola, and Agustin Echevarne and I visited the Secretary of Education and the Secretary of Early Childhood, Adolescence, and Family, and they're both now under the Ministry of Human Capital, a new ministry that the Argentinian government created by merging three different ministries. So the Ministry of Education, Early Childhood and Family, and also the Ministry of Labor, which I personally think is an excellent decision for reasons that we'll discuss on this panel. But when we started the meeting, Jim asked them very politely, what are your roles, or basically, why do you have a job if there's already a Minister of Human Capital? And it wasn't exactly phrased like that, and it was definitely very polite, but I think it was appropriate to bring that to our conversation today because human capital is about building skills throughout the life cycle of a person, which includes many aspects related to family, early childhood education, health, education during the school years, and certainly skills that people learn for the labor market and in the labor market. So the main point is that you can't untangle all of these things that are interrelated and connected throughout a person's life as they build the skills that will help them live successful and flourishing lives. So what you will hear today during the panel, we have four stellar academics and researchers who have studied these issues throughout their careers and will try to make those connections for us. You have their full bios in the event app, so I will just provide brief introductions now for the four of them. And as they're talking, you can, again, go to the app and submit your questions there, and we'll have a Q&A period at the end. So first we'll have James Heckman. So Jim is the Henry Schultz Distinguished Professor in Economics at the University of Chicago. He's also a senior fellow with the Archbridge Institute. He has been in Chicago's Department of Economics since 1973, and in 2014 he launched the Center for the Economics of Human Development, which he still leads. In 2000, he won the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he has won many other accolades in economics, being one of the most cited economists in the profession, but I think most relevant to this discussion, he has dedicated his life to studying social mobility, human flourishing, and social capital. Second, we'll have Carola Pessino, who is the senior economist in the Fiscal Management Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. She's in charge of coordinating knowledge in fiscal policy and management, and has led and collaborated in several fiscal strengthening programs in the region. She holds a master's degree in economics from UCEMA University, a master's degree and PhD from the University of Chicago, and she's the Secretary of Fiscal Equity of the Chief of Cabinet of Ministers in Argentina, and member of the Economic Council of Advisors to the Minister of Finance in Argentina between 1996 and 1999. Third, we'll have Eduardo Filgueira Lima. Eduardo is an international consultant in public health, health policies, and management of health services and insurance, having contributed to these areas with many organizations. He's a member of the Academic Council of Fundación Libertad y Progreso and a researcher and a university professor. He's a former Secretary of Health of the government of the province of La Pampa and a former Vice Minister of Health of the Ministry of Health in Argentina. And last but certainly not least, we'll have Martín Krause. Martín is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He's a professor of economics at UCEMA University in Buenos Aires and a visiting professor at the Universidad Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala and Universidad of the Hespérides. He also served as a rector of ESEADE and is a member of the Academic Council of Fundación Libertad y Progreso. So without further ado, let's start with Jim, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and in particular, to have a joint presentation with Carola Pessino. I'll give you a little bit of background about the talk that we're giving today. And when Carola was Minister or Secretary of Fiscal Equity here in the Menem government some 30 years ago, we developed a budget for Argentina, a skill budget for Argentina. And one of our suggestions was a Department of Human Capital that put together these integrated notions. And so today we get a chance to amplify on the theme, but to also strengthen our thinking about what we wrote 30 years ago and update it in light of a lot of new information that's been achieved. So what I want to argue, and I think this is our purpose today, is we want to argue that Argentina needs a skill-based learnings policy to promote dynamism and agency, and I mean ability to deal, the resiliency, the capacity to adapt and to take opportunities at all levels of society. And crucially, and I think this is missing in some of the programs, even the libertarian programs, is to teach children and to teach people and adults to internalize the values that promote flourishing and dynamic society. So one thing that we need to really get past, and I think this has been a mistake that many conservatives have made, they've adopted as the hero some of these people who make strong statements about genetics. The one thing we've learned in the last 30, 40, 50 years is that skills and preferences are not mainly genetically determined. There is a genetic basis, but there's a powerful role for influence, for education, and for learning. And I think people should harvest that information, and that's the main theme of our talk today. So what we've learned from a lot of work, a lot of research, is that skill gaps across socioeconomic groups open up very early. Skills are not set in stone at birth. They solidify as people age. They evolve and can be shaped. And when I say they can be shaped, that sounds like a menacing word. I'm not suggesting it be shaped by any particular government policy or by any particular bureaucrat, but the role of the family and the institutions of society that sustain society should be the primary shapers of learning and values. And so here's a graph that shows really what I'm saying. By the way, our talks are way too long. And what we're going to do instead is leave behind with you a very complete database, but we're going to only summarize that in our talks today. So you can see in this one score, in this one chart, which has been replicated in Colombia, in India, in China, but this is for the United States, that if you look at test scores of children over time, from age 3, when we can start measuring them accurately, to age 18, when they're making really important life decisions, that basically you can see that if the uppermost figure is that of the scores of the parents of the children whose parents are college educated, mothers college educated, and if you look at the bottom, those are the scores of children whose parents are dropouts. And what you can see is a profound difference between those two. And not only are the gaps substantial at 18, the gaps are substantial also at 3, certainly at 5, and they're maintained. And this is American data. And as a result, we have to really understand that a lot of the discussion about school quality and the quality of schools, the kind of technocratic discussion that dominates a lot of the international organizations, is really irrelevant. These children are going to vastly different schools. It's not that those schools are accelerating or diminishing, or that we can necessarily look to schools to close the gaps. I'm just asserting those gaps are there. And I also want to further assert that this is not an argument in favor of genetics primarily, or eugenics. What it is showing that those skills emerge early, and there's a possibility of doing something about it. So what I'm urging us to do today, and what I'm urging the Argentine policymakers to do, is to capitalize on the growing knowledge about skill and preference formation, and to really understand that even in the libertarian doctrine about having individual choice, we really need to come to terms with how individuals are created, how values are created. And that's a central part that I think has been neglected and left to technocrats and left to people who write in the schools of education and have very strong political views, and we've been very silent in trying to understand how we can create those values and promote a sense of agency and engagement and dynamism, therefore, in the society. So I just want to make 2 observations, which is supported by a lot of empirical work. First of all, and this is very, very important, when you look at the skills of a country, you want to move beyond just PISA scores. I realize there's a huge sales job by the OECD. There's a huge interest in test scores all around the world. You go to China, and they talk about how their Shanghai students do very well, and they're the best schools in the world by PISA scores, and on and on and on. But we've come to understand the inadequacy of those measures. If we look at what really is relevant, what we really learn in school, what are really important skills that emerge, and I'm talking about emerging long before we even get into school, that is things like personality, creativity, the ability to cope with new problems, and to understand a variety of aspects of human flourishing, which we generally ignore in the kind of established educational establishment literature. And secondly, and this is an important theme, and Carola will talk more about this, is recognizing the importance of the early years in creating those skills. So the early years are primarily the family years and the neighborhood years, and the time when the children, a major source of learning is, of course, imitation. Parents are being imitated. The neighborhoods and the environments are being imitated by the children. Understanding that understands then a much deeper way to think about learning and creation and the formation of those skills. So what we've come to understand, and this is something that I would just harp on repeatedly, but I don't have time to do it, is that if we look, for example, at inequality across lifetime earnings, what we find that most of the factors that are accounting for that are not explained simply by things happening after people leave school. We also understand that IQ, as we measure it, explains only a tiny fraction of variability across people. And this is something that gets ignored. When people talk about evaluating schools, they talk about educational policy, almost always using test scores, and that's a wrong approach. So I'll just make a point and leave this behind with you. The way that much social policy gets done, and this is why we wanted a Department of Human Capital, not a Department of Crime, not a Department of Health, because we should really understand that one notion is that we should solve problems as they arise. So if we have a problem with crime, we get more police. That's one obvious answer to that question. What we've come to understand, for example, is how powerful influencing the early years are in shaping the participation in crime. There's a very well-established body of work by a psychologist and epidemiologist named Terry Moffat at Duke and at University College London. And she has established, this question is, when do these problems emerge? Is it more efficient to start early and treat or start later? Obviously, for some problems, treat the problem once you see a problem. But what we've come to understand is that early prevention is very efficient. And so there's a principle out there which is used a lot and which actually has a lot of empirical support. In the handout that you have access to, you can actually see the data supporting it. But about 20% of the actors account for about 80% of the social problems. This is from long-term longitudinal studies, and they show the powerful importance of the early years. And what we can really see is that things that are tip-offs at a relatively early age are very important predictors, things that we can screen. And if we attack early enough, we can actually make major differences. And I'll show you exactly how important it is. I just don't have time to go. But I would repeat again and again that skills are much more than schooling, much more than formal education, much more than scores on tests. We want to think much more broadly about the full range of skills that it takes for human flourishing to occur. And so, for example, we think of motivation, self-regulation. Executive functioning turns out to be a very powerful role. It's a term the psychologists invent, but it's really the ability to adapt and to control one's emotions, and the ability then to provide what I would call agency or dynamism to one's life. To act, to face problems, to address the problems, to recognize the problems, and then to conduct one's life. And these skills emerge early. And I think this is a very important policy opportunity and a very important amendment, I think, to a lot of the discussions about individual choice, even in much of the libertarian doctrine. So anyway, we have a lot of evidence on predictability. I don't have time to go over it now. More than happy to talk about it, or you can look at it. But what we've also come to understand is the importance of the family. And we see, for example, the emergence of skills at a very early age, and how, for example, parenting, attachment, and altruism are very important. So, for example, the term scaffolding is used by a lot of child development experts. And what they talk about in this style is basically the ability to take a child, almost Pygmalion-like style, to build a sculpture, if you will, to build a person. And I'm not talking about shaping them in indoctrination. I'm talking about giving them the capacities to choose their own lives. And that's what I think flourishing needs to be. So to appropriate a term from Sin and Nussbaum, we should think about capabilities, but as a production possibility frontier, a range of choices that people can make. And this is what the new literature talks about, and we have evidence about the power. So I don't have time, but I will just say that it makes a lot of difference for the verbal environment that young children are exposed to for how well they do later on. And so we really have a lot of evidence on this, but I just don't have time to go through it, other than to say there's a dynamism here in the skills. So it's true that very smart and highly motivated children do better at college. There's no denying that. But it's also true that kids who aren't that smart or aren't that motivated at age 3 and 4 can be brought to that level. That is where the dynamics of skill formation has come to be understood. And there are a large variety of programs that have a voluntary component. I'm not talking about a government-run program. I'm not talking about a program like, Hitler Youth or some kind of indoctrination program. Not at all. I'm talking about programs that give parents and children opportunities that they can take or not take. And if they do take it, we can sometimes see substantial benefits. So what I would argue is that there is a powerful role. This is a curve associated with me, done years ago, but it's a thought experiment, and it's a thought experiment that has no counterpart in real policy. But it's a useful thought experiment because we ask the self the question, you have a child's life, and you can say, well, where do I put the most resources in a child's life? And the child is just born. In fact, it's not even born. It's a homunculus inside the womb of the mother. And you ask yourself, where is the maximum gain? Well, prenatal programs and early programs. And you say, well, why is that true? And that's not saying empirically that job training has no effect. It has a huge effect for those who are motivated and skilled. But what happens is if we build the skill base, we can then build a life which is filled with choices that these people are able to make to actually promote their own well-being. So I think we have a lot of evidence. Unfortunately, we don't have time, but you will get the handout if you wish, which will show you this. But I will show you there's one project called Perry Preschool, which did an intervention with disadvantaged children in a suburb, or really a small town just west of Detroit called Ypsilanti. And these children were all primarily African-American children. They were all at risk. This was in the 1960s. There was an experiment run where they tried a program which essentially was starting to build agency and participation. So the curriculum, if you want to call it that, was the students came in, they planned a task, they did a task, and they reviewed the task collectively, but they also then with the teacher. And there were home visits, teaching the mother how she might be able to facilitate the learning of the child. And what we saw, and we've seen from this and other studies, was an annual rate of return in terms of the investment after tax, all the distortions associated with tax, of 10% return per annum over the lifetime. And we followed these children from their 1960s to now they're in their late 50s, and we have this data on how well they've done. And I'll just summarize briefly that not only do these children benefit, but their children's children benefit. So we follow the children. We can see that the home life of those children is expanded. When the children are young, the parents are more likely to be intact, earnings are likely to be there and support the child and so forth, stable marriage rates and so forth. And not only do the children benefit, but at the same time, the siblings of the children benefit. And again, looking at benefit-cost ratios, you see substantial benefits that are as high as 9, if you count all the intergenerational and cross-sibling effects. I'll just leave you with 2 graphs and tell you why I think this is important for social mobility. This graph says a lot. It communicates the Perry study. If you look at the column on the left here of this slide, you'll see the correlation between the parent's education and the child's education. And in this population, which is disadvantaged, the correlation is about 0.8. That's for the control group. If you look at the next column, which basically doesn't appear for you, that is basically 0, which means the intergenerational correlation that's very well established as an empirical fact is broken. And if you can do the same thing for crime, again, strong correlation. If your parent was a criminal, you are likely to be a criminal. But when this kind of intervention is done, when these skills are built, when agency and flourishing is really maintained, you're going to see an absence of any correlation. And the same thing is true not only for boys, but also for girls. So I'm over my time, but I want to show you one last figure. This is something that surprises people, and this is why we think there should be a Ministry of Human Capital. One of these programs that originally was designed to boost IQ, this was in the 1960s, early 70s, when at that time everybody thought IQ is the be-all and end-all of human ability and the human capacity and what flourishing was all about. So this program had nothing to do with health, nothing. It was not targeting health. And yet when we follow, again, from a randomized trial, children at age 35, males in this case, we look, for example, at the treatment group and the control group. And if you look at these figures, I don't know if you can see them, but you can see the treatment group is far better off in terms of blood pressure, lower blood pressure. You can also see hypertension is substantially reduced. You can see the risks for diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and so forth are reduced. And this gives you something very surprising to many people. Why is it surprising? Well, because this is supposed to be a cognitive program. And what people don't understand is these enriched family environments are not teaching a single skill. They're teaching a way of life. They're teaching flourishing. So the reason why these results appear is not because they were indoctrinated about their health. It's because they developed the skills, the agency of self-control. They could have a certain knowledge. They were able to read the medical instructions and participate very actively. And here, if you look at this particular program, it's even higher rate of return because it's including the health benefits we couldn't measure with Perry. And I'll just leave you with one last thought. And again, this is the notion of intergenerational correlation. We've studied these programs. They're not expensive. And these programs, I keep insisting, are voluntary programs. They're programs at a minimal level, even as minimal as 1 hour a week, where parents are being given advice at their wish. It's nobody's telling anybody. And the people talking to these people are not overlords. They're people of the same village, of the same type. They're learning, they're teaching people of their own background and with their own culture the value of interacting with the child and engaging the child. And we have followed this program. This is in Jamaica, very cheap program. It's about 1/20th of the cost of these other programs I was talking about. And if you look at those results at 30, you see main effects, wages higher. You also see college attendance higher. And you can also see that IQ is boosted. Again, something that many people, I know many conservatives have pointed this out somehow for the waste and the inefficiency of government programs. But here, IQ is boosted, which means human capacities are boosted, which means that we can think about people who actively engage their own life. And so I'll just conclude with results from a similar program in Ireland, in the slums of Dublin. Oops, I can't go backward, I guess. Oh boy. I skipped my punchline, but there you go. What I was going to show you was basically in Dublin, a similar program was done. And if you compare the treatment group and the control group, like 10 years out, there's a very high correlation between the parents, the mother's IQ, and the child's IQ, 0.57. That goes essentially to 0. Oh, here, perfectly, sorry. So here we go, for example, on the control group. So we see at age 9, this correlation is about 0.57, very high correlation. If you look at the treatment group, the correlation's fallen to 18, 0.18. Again, intergenerational transmission of disadvantage has actually, or advantage, has actually been weakened. So you're really creating opportunity in a sense of enabling the individual to act, to be dynamic and to shape one's life. And so what I would argue that in summary of my part of the talk, and Carola will take over from this, is that Argentina faces many challenges, we know that, but I would argue one needs to build a culture of dynamism, and it starts at the school. People are very negligent about schools. And you have Paulo Freire shaping the agenda, and you have Marxist notions that are really embedded in the school system. You have to understand that that is where people are asking, well, why is it that these reforms aren't taken? Because at an early age, children are not really understanding these capacities, developing these capacities to independently evaluate and to act, and then to understand that some of the ideology that's being forced on them is in fact invalid. So what I would argue is that Argentina should take this notion, cultivate risk-taking, easy to say, but I think we can do that. These people are more creative in the sense they're outgoing, they're engaging, they're active, they're living human beings, flourishing human beings, living up to what their potentials are. But I think we need to go beyond the standard framework of looking only at test scores and what you see from the curriculum of ed schools. My own personal belief is, at least in the United States that I've seen, is that a lot of the schools of education have been major sources of intellectual waste and intellectual disorder. It really not creating knowledge, but essentially destroying it and providing curricula instead of learning. And I think that has to be a major change. So thank you very much. And I introduce Carola next, who's my co-author, former student, and very talented human being.
I'm very honored by the invitation of Cato Institute and Libertad and Progreso for forming part of this panel of excellence, especially with Professor Heckman, who not only directed my PhD thesis several decades ago, but along the following decades, he has been mentoring all along my career until now. The work he just shown put in the broad spectrum of human capital and even broader human development theory with hard theory and empirical evidence as nobody else in this world does like Professor Heckman. So the evidence is clear, is credible, and is the best you can see. He gathers the evidence, and until it is credible, he never shows any of the results. So it's a luxury to have him here with all his engagements in the US, Denmark, China, and so on. When he came to Argentina the first time, that I brought him to help me convince the government to improve the skill formation in Argentina. It was a bit ahead of our time. So 25 years later, in a silver anniversary of that time, we heard about this human capital ministry, and it seemed the right moment to update our paper. So this is a continuation of our paper, and I will go over what we did and what is the data in Argentina and the evidence on how skills are being formed. Well, this I thank you, all the people that collaborated in this paper. So skill formation in Argentina has deficiencies along the life cycle in promoting equality, social mobility, and growth. We have a full life cycle where skills and learning is formed. Learning begins much earlier than formal schooling, 5 or 6 years earlier. This is usually ignored in most of our governments and doesn't end up in schooling. It continues at work. Skills continue to be formed when you enter work and for a very long time. We need to formulate policies that recognize how these skills are formed instead of proceeding with fragmented policies that are usually ineffective because they don't look where the rates of return are higher. As Professor Heckman has researched in several of his best publications, the policy should be prevention or pre-distribution rather than redistribution later on. So we will highlight some. I don't have time to go over all the slides, so we will highlight the early childhood, the first stage, and what happens along the life cycle of the people. As he said, Jim said, parents are the better providers of skills, socio-emotional, character, motivation, a myriad of skills, but not all children have the same motivating parents in early childhood. So the programs he just showed, the Perry program, Jamaican program, provide mainly not schooling or cognitive skills directly to the children, but they motivate their parents to give this information to kids. There are home visitation programs. They start from very early ages. From 0 to 3 years, they are the most effective, and they have these huge rates of return for life. In Argentina, we don't have enough data to calculate early childhood returns on wages or other later outcomes in life. We don't either have data, randomized controlled trials, and mostly we don't have targeted early childhood programs in this country. So we use PISA data that has cognitive and some non-cognitive outcomes of going to preschool. As we know, Argentina is very backward in PISA scores, not only lower than any country in the OECD, but is also number 66 and in the middle of the Latin American countries. The worst part is that there is a very large gap between children with more educated parents with ways, this gap opens up very early in their lives. So what we did is use this data because we had, going back, we had a big increase in universal preschool at ages 4 and 5. The enrollment increased a lot. At age 5 is almost 100%, but age 4 and under age 4 increased also a lot, much more in the highest quartile of income distribution, as usually happens. What we see, and this was in figure 1 that Jim showed, PISA scores have a high distance between parents with low education and parents with high education. There is one standard deviation of difference, and if we include other wealth, long-term wealth of their parents apart from education, the distance is about 1.6. So what we did is to do an econometric analysis, and we show that with 1 year of early childhood education decreases this distance in a fifth of the 1.6 standard deviations. But it increases much more to children of low educated parents, as we expected. Not only that, but part of the skills increase with these programs was through increase in these socio-emotional skills that Heckman, Professor Heckman was talking, like presentism and perseverance, and a mediation that decrease the effect of early childhood, that directly decrease the impact of early childhood through these non-cognitive skills. Also including what usually is the knowledge that countries use is, say, to improve readiness, to improve academic performance, we should train teachers, construct more schools, make schooling compulsory. When we add these variables, the effect is very low in most of our regressions. So having parents with motivating kids, having a kid that went early to school, started early, that is explaining most of the return in PISA and not the schooling itself. When we go, in this case, let me finish to saying that the economic case for universal early childhood is weak. Better target programs might cost less to implement and have more results. In Argentina's situation, no hay plata, we cannot spend a lot of money, and we saw earlier in the map of Argentina that I showed that lots of provinces, there is a huge difference in preschool rooms and teachers across provinces. So provinces can do a very effective early childhood program with much less money than preschool that costs about almost 0.5 of GDP. We are talking about $700 against more than $1,700 per kid to improve their situations. So a targeted, high-quality program can be implemented at much less costs. What about now going to schooling investments? Here, we cannot do pre-distribution because the big return is in the early years. So we need to remediate if the children arrive to elementary school and high school without these preschool or early childhood programs. We need to remediate their lack of skills if they come from disadvantaged households. In this case, mentoring is like parenting these kids again, helping them regain socio-emotional skills to have motivation to finish. That's a thing that is not done in many countries and not apparently in Argentina. As I say, they follow usually the recipes of build more school, train teachers, provide free universal schooling. And these kids that come from disadvantaged neighborhoods, families, they need the best teachers. They need much more time from them to recoup, and regain skills. In this case, wages in Argentina and in many countries are fixed. You cannot pay more the teachers that go to dangerous neighborhoods, and and they have to put much more effort in these kids. We can do competition of schools also. We cannot do them in Argentina because they don't even publish the results from the tests programs. So a voucher could help if parents have information about which school is better. So what are the outcomes of these policies? Very bad cognitive outcomes were, in the back of the PISA scores. And also we have the problem, if you see high school increased a lot from when we were with Jim 25 years ago. So enrollment increased a lot, but dropout continues to be more or less the same. And this is not a problem of credit constraints, it's mostly a problem that do not have the early skills needed to finish. The same happens, well, here we show vintage graphs from that time. So yes, graduation in high school increased, but the dropout continues to be immense and much higher in the lower quartiles of income. University enrollment also increased during the last 20 years, but here dropout is even larger. They say that the dropout is 40% during the first year. Of course, the dropout is much larger for the people with lower quartiles of income. That to us is a measure of earlier skills that these kids acquire. So it's a problem of readiness, maybe, of going to university. They are not ready, they quit. Also a problem that university in Argentina, public university, tends to be free. And you see, here when we divide the sample in private and public universities, we have that most of the kids in public universities are in the first quartile of income distribution. So we are subsidizing the rich to go to private universities. So we are spending a lot of money. This is a graph using data from the OECD. We are spending about more than 1% of GDP. That is higher than the average of the OECD. It's double of what Japan and UK spends on universities. And you see the outcome. We produce much less graduates than any country in the OECD, 19% against 47% with more money. So we are not being very efficient in having people from poor backgrounds finishing university. We are giving free university to people that can pay, and we are not producing so many graduates. Another difference we find is the lower returns to education. High school and university education went down a lot in the last 20 years since we were here. University education had a rate of return 16, 17%. That was more or less what you expect from this kind of education. Now it's barely 8%. So it went down a lot, and there are lots of questions. There are lots of theories you can use, but basically it shows a stagnated, so the stagnation, when you talk about the last 20 years or the last 100 years, maybe the last 20 years were the worst, not only stagnated the macroeconomy, but also stagnated all our human capital. And when you count the real rate of return to university education, when that was 16, now is 8, that's the private return. But when you calculate social return of how much the government spends on each graduate, this goes even lower to 4%, and it continues going down. This is a real tragedy because we are forming people, graduates, that they want to leave the country. They want to go out, you know, they have the skills, no? That's brain drain. This is an important part of the economy that we are letting go, and I think when the dynamism begins, this should begin to grow again. It's complementary with investment, the investment in human capital. So here you see that tertiary education, that are the yellow part of, these are all the countries or most of the countries in Latin America, is basically pro-rich. So you invest in tertiary education, the public spending is mostly going to the rich. The third part that is also very important is when these people that learn, some people learn a lot, most people, and people with bad backgrounds without early childhood, they come with deficiencies to the labor market. And the labor market, what it does is what you can see very fast. We have a very, well, I don't need to tell you here, but we are the country with the highest labor costs in all Latin America. If you see, Argentina is here is almost the same as Brazil. I hope we gain to Brazil next CAP, but here we are almost the same, with very bad records of having very high extra wage costs. So these are non-wage costs of labor. What happens to that is that when these are very high, people leave the formal sector, wages go down in the formal sector, they go to the informal. In Latin America, there is much less unemployment than informality, so people go into the informal sector, where skills are even valued less than in the formal sector. So all the skills that were built in the early years are reversed when these people go to the market. This is not only we have this extra wage, extra labor cost, but also we have something we call a subsidy to informality. To all the informal people, we give them basically the same transfers that we give people that are in the formal sector. Non-contributory pensions, moratorias, PUAM, we give them also asignaciones, and the condition is that they are basically informal to accept them. So this is putting a wedge for these people to enter the formal sector. There are lots of papers showing these effects that I don't have time to talk, but you can ask me later. So the skills that are built when you work are much lower in the formal sector in Argentina than in more developed countries. The formal sector is half, and the informal sector is half of the formal sector. Gary Becker, another Nobel Prize, used to say that on-the-job training and learning by doing is about 50% of human capital. Here is 20% at most on the conditions of this country. So here, I think the law is needed in Argentina, the law that is in Congress, to decrease extra labor costs. The rigidity of the labor market is very important, and to begin to decrease the welfare state as soon as the situation for the poor becomes better, because usually all these transfers are timed in other countries, so they don't last forever, is to begin to replace them, like they did in the US, by a subsidy to formality. So Professor Heckman, Professor Phelps, they advise on subsidies instead of giving the asignación universal por hijo to stay at home or say I cannot work or something like that, we give the same money or even more if they go to the formal sector and work. And this was a transformation that was done in the US in the last 20 to 30 years. Now maybe it will be undone. So this shows up in inequality. The educational mobility in Argentina went down. That's a good thing that happened. So you will expect that income mobility education mobility increase. So in this case, the transmission from parents to children, as Jim showed you, is lower. And this is because of all the schooling that was acquired in the later years in Argentina. So you expect that income mobility also will increase. But it increased, but is much less, and it is much higher than the increase in education. This is because skills are not transmitted through education alone. I mean, having more years of education doesn't mean to have more skills. So we can talk about this later. But the last part is that human capital is not only a policy to improve equity, but also growth, especially in Latin America. Usually, most growth theories talk about the importance of physical capital. Human capital in Latin America is, given the situation we have in most countries, and in Argentina also, is as important as physical capital to improve growth rates. So everyone should pay attention to improve skills, and begin in the early years. And this is not a matter of money. You can do it with the same money you have. In this analysis we did in this paper, when you control for the quality of human capital and the investment, private investment, public investment, the sum of those, more expenditure on education doesn't help in growth. So it's not basically spending, but the quality of skills that you build. Well, summary, I leave you later for you, but more or less I've been giving you the lessons. Thank you very much.
Eduardo, please.
You stole some of my time, but it's okay, just a joke.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure for me to speak before you today, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to take part in this panel. I'm the only one who will speak about something different, which is not directly related to education, which is human capital and health. And although this may seem to be an element of little importance, health is a factor that supports the ability to acquire knowledge, investment, skills that both Professor Heckman and Carola Pessino have discussed here, and Dr. Krause for sure will speak about that. And actually all these skills and the claim they make, as it was said before, is clearly to generate income into the future along the time while individuals take part in a productive life, and this allows the development of economic development. And with those words, we have made a cloud here, a word cloud, where you can see that these concepts repeat themselves. So there are 4 key elements that are social environment, environmental, context, health, and education to allow the development of human capital. This is a paper done by Professor James Heckman in Jamaica, as he mentioned, where it says that economic intervention or small interventions in early childhood may increase the performance in the workspace and in productivity up to 25% 2 decades later. This is a paper done in Jamaica and which he mentioned. And this is a direct correlation that has been proven between the GDP of a country and the human capital index, where you have a correlation which is almost direct. A match is made where there is a line which establishes that the correlation is direct and positive. However, in our country, Argentina, if you take the basis, the 0, as an average indicator of development of 7 countries, as of the 50s, our country has had a loss in the economic development that has been drastic, to the point that after 2010, it has exceeded 50% regarding that potential for development the country had before. And the consequence is this: poverty. And out of this situation, the prospects for acquiring human capital becomes much more difficult. Here we can see another paper which is related to what was mentioned before, which says that from the cradle to the labor market, the effects of birth weight on adult outcomes, the possibilities for production in adults. In other words, these are all the variables for which malnutrition may end up occurring in early childhood, and the multiplicity of factors that are involved in malnutrition. And this is a key factor which was mentioned and which is also related to the possibility of acquiring knowledge in these conditions, and which become very difficult because the adversity affects the development of the brain in the child. And this raises that in children that suffer from malnutrition, they may display lower cognitive skills. Let's pass on now to the key point, how we can have health as a factor in the development of human capital. Well, this is our population situation today. As you can see in the chart, 60% of the population has conditions to be insured and 40% related to that guarantee in health. These are the number of people that have no health insurance at all, and this population here is actually a population that you will see here that has no health insurance at all, and as part of everything that has been discussed here and the role that could be played by health, the fact that you may have a health insurance will empower people to be able to develop the basic needs and to be able to be served. And that is a key need and a key point that we will develop here in our discussion, and which at this point places us in a point of vulnerability for this population regarding the possibility for them to meet their basic needs and to be provided with health care. What are we doing in health today? I'm referring to that population, that core, 40% of the Argentine population that is below the poverty line, 40% which has no great prospects than to go to the public hospital. That's the only possibility, taking the words of Venegas Lynch, Dr. Venegas, public hospital, state hospital as we know it. That will provide the services for that portion of the population. So we develop programs. These are care programs that are a subsidy to supply. They are sustained in time without any type of evaluation or review. They promote high bureaucracy. They are transfers that go to the provinces, to the city halls, municipalities, for the hospitals to do what they need to do as part of the obligations. So it is like an overcharge. I'm discussing this with some manager. He told me that these are considered as incentives, but they are not incentives at all, because sometimes things are not done, and in many municipalities the mayors prefer to outsource these programs. They are accumulated like geological layers, and they are overlapped. These programs are highly inefficient as to their outcomes regarding the health care in public hospitals. Under the state management, they have a captive audience of the public hospital because that's the only caregiver. It's a monopoly where the population is captive and without any possibilities of choosing any other provider of care. And they are a subsidy to supply, and this leads to an absence of incentives to improvement, and there is an excess supply because they tend to multiply. This is what ends up happening. We're spending in health. How much are we spending? 10% of the Argentine GDP. However, the results are equal to countries that spend 6% of their GDP. 4 points of GDP are lost, therefore, because of some inefficiency mechanism or out of corruption or any other matters that you may imagine. But there are two ways. Either we spend 10% of GDP and we do things well, or let's spend 6% to let things go as they are today. The proposals, and these have been worked on for some time, and I want to thank engineer Manuel Soranet, the person who we started working with many years ago, I don't want to count them, on our research on the reform of the health system in Argentina. And finally, and after many things we've gone through, I will try to convey to you some general concepts and ideas that are drivers for our discussion. First, a priority health policy should be to have a universal health coverage by introducing health insurance to 19 million people who are not insured today through a subsidy to demand. You may have read yesterday in the newspapers that the municipality of San Nicolas has started a system whereby the municipality insures people who do not have a social or welfare or any health care and do not have any type of prepaid insurance company to get their health care, to pay for themselves. Those population members are captive to public hospital. There is absence to incentives. There are limitations as to the access to health, and nobody is concerned about that. And those hospitals do not have the incentives to improve their quality and efficiency. This is the #1 policy that should be led. Fortunately, the Ministry of Health has been part of this initiative of this municipality of San Nicolas, the city of San Nicolas, and I'm really happy because they are making a step forward, which in the area of our country is indispensable today, to give a priority to health as a policy. Who provides the health insurance? Well, this has gone through different phases. A few years ago, I was a firm defender that it should be the provinces, the states, because they have not delegated their health role to the nation. So it is a primary responsibility of the provinces to provide for health. But it could occur that when you analyze the situation, you might think that, and I don't see the governors with a lot of initiatives to make changes in health. They are very comfortable there. There is a comfort zone they do not go out of, and they prefer the status quo before making any substantial changes. But that's my personal opinion. Also, when you analyze the province constitutions, they have not delegated the health care services. They don't speak about the funding. So the possibility to have a national insurance to fund the population and the demand of population that is spread all over the country, of course in the provinces, but who do not have a health insurance coverage, could be a prospect to insure them via the national way. But we should fund the demand in that case, and the supply could be for the manager of those resources, if possible. Not all the provinces, of course, can do it or do it well, but of course we could have also the state HMOs, or as agreed upon. The idea is to do it, but it is always necessary to have an agreement with the provinces, if that is the way to take, because the primary health responsibility is of the provinces. But the ultimate responsibility is by the nation. There is also an exclusive responsibility of the national government. One is the Pensioner and Retired Institute, PAMI, which has a captive population. The health ministry has very little influence on that, only a marginal influence. It is intervened by the political power as well. It is also really a fund for funding politics, and it doesn't comply with the roles it should have as an institute to provide healthcare services to the retirees. And our proposal, after all the proposals that have been made for PAMI, for the reform of PAMI, ours is to make it a national HMO under the law of the Superintendency of Health. The Superintendency of Health should also now become the National Health Insurance Agency to regulate national agencies, but also the prepaid insurance, health insurance companies, and also those who are not insured, who may become part of the system. So it should go beyond the roles it has today. Under the Ministry of Health, the Superintendency is not an agency where the Ministry of Health may have a lot of influence on. So I believe that it could be better to take this role, because now it is a political power that has an influence on it. We could also have a technology evaluation agency created, an independent one, with all these roles, the modification of the PMO, The government is working on it, and that is worthy of recognition. But I think there should be a technology evaluation agency that knows about this. The protocols for diagnosis and treatment, the definition of pathologies of exception to be covered outside the health program. And one thing is to be also a mechanism for advice, for counseling, for the decisions taken by the justice system in the area of health. And the policy of medications, of drugs, 35–38% of the spending on health is held by medications. Also, a solidarity fund under the Superintendency of Health, the FSR, should be actually converted to a reassurance or reinsurance for high-cost pathologies, low-incidence pathologies, to be able to also clear up what's the fund going to. Although it may seem as a paradox, it is funding actually the operating expenses of the health superintendency. And the World Bank has also pointed to this anomaly. The superintendency is funded by funds that actually the workers' funds, actually those that should be regulated by the superintendency. And finally, a modernization of the health ministry is another proposal we're making. This has many factors related to the programs, the secretariats that exist today, which I believe should have a different name, a different role. But this is just a personal idea and just a suggestion overall that goes beyond a conversation such as we're having today. But I do believe that we need to seek efficiency of the health system. Now let's see the objectives. To gain efficiency in health institutions, because the resources that are lost, the 4% lost, is actually needed to be allocated correctly in other areas that are needed, to provide more freedom to people. And this is a key factor which is related to our conference today, to provide freedom, the rebirth of freedom for Argentina and the world, and to gain more health results and better health results. This is expected also, and to contribute as a facilitating support for the acquisition of human capital and for the productive life of people. These are the objectives, and this is a slide I would like to give to you, and this is the work that I have described to you, trying to stick to my time. I wrote a paper that I have given to Libertad y Progreso, the think tank that I would like to thank for the possibility to work with and to generate things related to health and public policies. And now, I believe that a final conclusion to this would be how much human capital can be leveraged with the generation of income and productivity if the institutional quality of the country is not the adequate one. And when I speak of institutional quality, what I mean is the work done by Dr. Krause, which are really a central input to think about the opportunities being given really to those who need it. Thank you.
Bien, Eduardo. There is an anecdote that at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a meeting in Washington, D.C. They were trying to set up a kind of a regional organization, what would many years later be the Organization of American States. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs met there, and they were speaking in English in Washington. But then comes the Argentine Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he started speaking in Spanish. And it seems that there were no translators. And when he then submitted a proposal that Spanish should also be the official language of this future organization, the motion was approved. And once it was approved, he turned into speaking in English. And I'm going to do the same, but the opposite. So I'm going now into Spanish. ¿ok? Así que cambien y vamos a España. Quiero agradecer a las dos organizaciones.
I'd like to thank both organizing institutions that have made this seminar possible, Cato Institute and Fundación Libertad and Progreso. Curiously enough, I belong to both organizations, and for the very first time, I am a member of both institutions within the Board of Trustees of Cato Institute and Libertad and Progreso. Once again, many thanks to both institutions. And I would like to honor the memory of David Bose, who has been Executive Vice President of Cato Institute for decades, and that, unfortunately, he passed away 2 days ago after a long battle against cancer. The results gained by Argentina are the following. Let me do some history. Many years ago, a group of enlightened Argentinians started to develop an institutional framework which turned Argentina into a miracle. Argentina became an amazing leading case of progress and development, ranking first or second best in terms of advancement, progress, and the like. Those enlightened Argentinian men established and set up an educational system taking ideas from the USA and Europe based on mandatory primary schooling, free of charge schools, and the provision of public schools, in this case state-run schools, and a list of minimum contents that were mandatory as well. That institutional framework in Argentina meant great success for our country, and that educational framework produced positive results. More than 80% of the population was illiterate. In 30 to 40 years, this number dropped by half. So, as you can see, this system, which was put in place by these enlightened people who were classical liberals, I should say, was based on educating the people, what we call the sovereign people in Spanish. And as the Argentinian economy was successful, our country was a pole of attraction for many inhabitants. More than 30% of the Buenos Aires city population did not speak Spanish at the beginning of the 20th century. And political leaders were worried about this fact and wanted to strengthen and consolidate the features of the educational system to forge a national identity in such a way through mandatory education, because there was a culture that was being developed spontaneously at the time where the tango music was emerging, love for soccer and love for friendship, which are core values for we Argentinians. The features of the educational system were consolidated and strengthened. But when populism emerged, the mandatory system turned into an indoctrination-based system, because, as you know, populism runs the risk of becoming indoctrination. At the very early stage of Perón's first administration, there was a cult to the personality of leader Perón and his wife Evita. And then we had a lot of upside downs, ups and downs, upheavals, and the system started to deteriorate in the long run, as Carola mentioned in her presentation. In the last PISA test scores, we also have another one, Aprender test scores. PISA belongs to Oxford and then TERCE from UNESCO. In the last Aprender test scores, the percentage of students, 6th grade, elementary, low performance in maths, 48%, language, 33%. Only 22% out of 100 Argentinian students age 15 are not dropouts, pass their tests, and have a standard proficiency development in writing and reading, taking into account the data provided by the Argentinian Observatory for Education. Another NGO, Observar Educación, showed that 68% of the population thinks that Argentinian education is worse than before. Average grades, 4.8%. You pass a test with 6 points in Argentina, of course. So we have unorganized or disorganized fathers, mothers, family environments. There is lack of organization in the field of the law of education, which bans that test scores be publicly disclosed in order to avoid the stigma against students that have not passed their test. But they are, of course, preventing parents from getting information on the final results of their children in these tests. So the core topic of our educational discussion in Argentina by educational experts and educational stakeholders is the following, which is generally neglected in those discussions, because we discuss about how should the Argentinian educational system look like. But we have to take into account that there are diverse preferences and we have diverse resources to meet such a goal. I'm going to mention the problem that I have just mentioned, populism becoming an indoctrination system. Let me share an example with you. In the year 2004-2005, we designed a project whereby we created primary content for all schools, whether public, private, whatever school. All schools should give the same contents. You can choose a school, private or public, but it is as if I were telling you, you can choose the suit you like best, but it should be gray, all right? You can choose the suit you like best, but the color of such a suit should be gray. Well, there's not much leeway for you to make your choice for any additional choice. These are common mandatory contents. Let me show you some examples. Against this backdrop, we are educating people for a society which is ruled by inequality, where people should fight for collective rights by means of street demonstrations, screaming so as to, of course, get social benefits in order to reduce the inequality gap. Some examples. Remember those priority common contents. two subjects, citizen involvement and formation, and then social sciences. Number one, the knowledge that in the current world we have different groups with different habits, origins, interests that have an equal access to material and symbolic goods and assets. By taking examples from all over the world, there is no mention to the voluntary social cooperation, which is exemplified by markets, free markets. Now, example number 2, pupils, age 7, citizen involvement and formation, the use of public speech and recognition of social effect, whether reading or writing, participation in group assemblies, participation in group demonstration, meetings. Age 7 and age 8, choosing delegates to attend those group meetings, to file petitions. Age 8, what are they really forming or educating? Militants rather than students or full-fledged citizens. There's always an emphasis laid on conflicts. There is no mention as to the wealth of capitalism, industrial revolution, people exiting from abject poverty. No, they say the introduction of changes by the industrial revolution in shaping society and its conflicts, as well as its influence in the Spanish colonies in the Americas. Nothing, nobody mentions the Industrial Revolution. And then, when the common contents speak about labor relations, work conditions, and work flexibilization. Here, flexibilization means a negative aspect. Common contents teach students tragedy cases, such as the ones I'm going to mention right now. Inter alia, cases of discrimination and genocide to the First Nations, Armenian people, apartheid, Holocaust, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, among others. Those others do not include Russian, Soviet gulags or victims from the Chinese Revolution in Cambodia. Stephanie Couture says 18 million in the Soviet Union, 20 million, Holodomor, Ukraine, 5 million, and North Korea, 2 million. Any mention of those common contents? No mention at all. What else? The period of progress in Argentina is seen as follows. By the end of the turn of the 1900s, the analysis of primary exporting integration of Latin American economies in the international capitalist market between 1880 and 1930, in light of consolidation of conservative oligarchic regimes, is what we can see along that period. These are the ideas that have been included in the core common contents of our educational plan. The influence of social, political, and cultural impact of the Cuban Revolution and the policies of U.S. intervention in the Americas in the process of decolonization and the Cold War. None of these contents in Argentina is reasonable. None of these contents speak about economics. no mention about markets. There are power relationships. What is the content in economics? Reflecting on the international relations in light of the asymmetries among states in the process of building territories all over the world and in Argentina. These are the common, core, mandatory educational contents now in force in Argentina. So, in my opinion, these dramatic changes should be operated on prior to making the system efficient and effective, because the system should be efficient and effective to convey ideas. And, in fact, these ideas are not the most able ideas. Many personalities say education is a weapon to change the world, but this is a metaphor, of course. But changes that are made by means of weapons have not always been favorable. I would rather use the sentence by Plutarch, mind is not a glass to be filled. It is a spark or a fire that we should ignite.